And we can begin. Okay, and we are now on. We're now on YouTube. Welcome to everybody on YouTube. And Ton, would you like to make the introduction?
Welcome everyone. I would like to remind you that this meeting is being recorded. If you don't want to see your face on YouTube forever after, please turn off. This is Sephardic World. We bring you weekly meetings about Sephardic genealogy and history. And we are quite successful at this in the sense of a large audience and the regularity of our meetings. And as always, we thank our patrons who make all of this possible. And we thank our viewers on YouTube for joining us. If you are willing to become a patron, please join us at our Patreon page. And you can support us and be with us live in the Zoom and ask questions there. Today, we have with us Julian Land, who trained in theoretical physics and mathematics. And I always wonder how someone like that ends up in genealogy. But more persons trained in theoretical physics and mathematics end up there. So there may be a pattern there. Julian and his wife and me, we met each other in 2013, I believe. In some sense, that was a disaster because we were going to visit the Rijksmuseum, and the Rijksmuseum decided to have a fire drill at that very moment. And everyone was driven out of the museum. But in another sense, it was a very pleasant meeting. Julian will talk about the Louzada family this time, about his recent research into the family, and about 9 Lousadas who made it in the world. And I welcome Julian to begin his talk.
Thank you very much, Ton, and thank you, Ton and David, for creating these opportunities to talk about one's work, because it is a very important thing. The fortunate Baruch Lousadas, I wanted to understand, hang on. Here we go. The question I have in my mind, I have had in my mind for many years, and only now I'm starting to understand why. How did they make their amazing transition from shoemakers in provincial Portugal to success in the Atlantic world? This was a big step. All that I talk about is on the family history website there. If I fail to answer any questions about what I've said, then you will find the answer on the website. And just a few geographical details. There are some towns called Lousada in Portugal, and just near Porto, the big town, and 2 outlying towns. You can also see Bragança, which was a provincial capital. Lousadas spent some time at Vinhas, which is a small town, but the Inquisition still managed to find them there. Other families I talk about today came to Madrid from Villaflor, which is near the Douro in northern Portugal. Some of the Lousada ancestors came from Lamego in just south of the Douro. To get to Madrid from here, of course, you have to go up the Douro. You get off at Barcadalba and across to Salamanca and then across to Madrid. But that is how you do it today anyway. The Baruch Lousadas first appear as a family of shoemakers who were processed by the Coimbra Inquisition around 1590, and then also around 1656. In the period between 1590 and 1656, in the intermediate period, some of them made their way to Madrid, where wealthy and influential in-laws were acquired. And here we have a shot of Madrid, a nondescript shot, but it's a nice feel for Madrid. From these wealthy and influential in-laws, they were able to find the means to leave Spain, and those links led them to many other connections and some success in the Atlantic world. When I say they're a family of shoemakers, you can see this from the Inquisition records. The first person to be imprisoned by the Inquisition was Emanuel de Lousada, a shoemaker from Vinhais, and Anna Menzies, his wife. As you can see from the photo, Vinhais is a tiny town, but as I say, the Inquisition still found them. They were imprisoned in Coimbra in 1590-91 with their eldest daughter, Beatrice, who I'll mention later. Here is a shot of Coimbra at about this time, thanks to Edgar Samuel, who pointed out that where the house of a common ancestor lived. Other children in the family were Fernando, Isabel, Francisco, Diego, Antonio, and Pedro. Isabel Mendes de Lousada, that second daughter there, had a son, Antonio, who left a 1656 will in Madrid. And this is the only direct evidence we have that the Lousadas actually went to Madrid. The rest is inference. The next round of inquisitional torment was widow Florenza Carrial of Vinhais, widow of Fernando de Lousada, also a shoemaker. She was imprisoned in 1657. Then her children, Antonio, also a shoemaker, Henriques, also a shoemaker, and Maria were also imprisoned. Who were the wealthy and influential in-laws? Principally, these wealthy in-laws were Abraham Israel Pereira, who was born in Villaflor. His parents' names are given there, and I mentioned the name of his mother, Beatrice Geronima, because that arises later. He married in Madrid in 1628 and died in Amsterdam. His son, Jacob Israel Pereira, was also very important to the Baruch Lousadas. He was born in Madrid but died in Amsterdam. I'll say a little about Abraham Israel Pereira. This is not a comprehensive study of him, but he managed to clarify who his parents were and his early life in some of our commissioned work in Madrid. I'll give him credit for that work later on. He was a wool exporter and a financial investor in Madrid with the name of Thomas Rodrigue Pereira. He was part of the wealthy exodus of wealthy Portuguese New Christians after Count Duke d'Olivares was deposed in 1643. Olivares, of course, held the Inquisition at bay for reasons of keeping the wealthy Portuguese New Christians in Madrid. When Olivares fell, the Inquisition was slowly let off the leash, and it wasn't a good place to be unless you were immensely powerful. Pereira invested with his brother Isaac in the first Jewish-owned sugar refinery in Amsterdam in 1655. And a small image here tells a story about this. The A and the I don't require much explanation, but the triangular shape in the middle is a sugar loaf. When sugar was refined in those days, the pregnant liquor was poured into funnels. Crystals would collect in the neck of the funnel. When the funnel was full, you'd keep the pregnant liquor going until it was clear, so all the molasses was out, and you have a nice pile of white crystals. But what you did then was you dried the funnel, tipped it upside down, and you got a nice cake of sugar, the sugar loaf. The wealthy people would have a sugar loaf on their table, And the guests, in addition to their knife and fork and spoon, would have little silver tongs, and you would dig your own sugar out of the sugar loaf in the middle of the table. The date of 1659 is also interesting for those interested in technological innovation. You always worry when the investment is made in 1655, and 4 years later, it takes to get the first sugar out. Clearly, there were teething problems. Maybe the process was a little novel, and maybe the Pereira brothers acted a bit like venture capital. They got the plant going, and then they sold it in the mid-1660s. A number of reasons for this sale could be that we don't know when Isaac died, but perhaps Abraham was thinking of going to the Holy Land, and he was selling up everything, but that's another story. A remarkable thing about the sugar refinery, and Daniel Swetsinski notes this, there was one Jewish employee of the sugar refinery. His name was Raphael Montesinos from Venice, which is an interesting fact, which we'll perhaps touch on a little later. Pereira, with brother Isaac, supported Manasseh ben Israel, who, from the English perspective, was the spiritual leader of the push to resettle England. And we have a widely accepted portrait of Manasseh ben Israel by a very good painter, whose signature you will see there on the right of the subject. Stephen Nadler is a doubter that this is actually Manasseh ben Israel, but he does concede that, in fact, there's a good family resemblance. So I think for practical purposes, that is a portrait of Manasseh ben Israel. He was a leader of the push. He died in 1657 before Jews were formally admitted to England, and this was a source of distress for him. He was a writer and publisher, and he was supported by the Pereira brothers. And you can see from this that the first supporter was actually Isaac, because, and this is before Abraham gets to Amsterdam, the new yeshiva, the first yeshiva that the Pereiras started in Amsterdam, was associated only with Isaac. And so the credit is given by Manasseh ben Israel to Isaac in elegy for a new yeshiva. It's not until 1647, the next dedication he makes to the Pereiras. He thanks both brothers in a book called, in English, Treasure of the Laws. That is, Isaac came first to Amsterdam, and Abraham a little later. Perhaps it was via Venice, although I haven't found direct proof that he came by Venice, but it's widely stated that he did. How did Abraham Israel Pereira help the Baruch Lousadas? And I have more questions than answers here. Did he or Isaac bring some of them to Amsterdam as employees? I think the answer is probably yes, but I can't prove that. Did he facilitate the London connections of the Amsterdam Jews? Again, I can't prove that, but there are some very interesting things I will observe later about this. Did the Baruch Lousadas clearly met the Mercados who'd come from Dutch Brazil? It wasn't Abraham Israel Pereira who introduced the Baruch Lousadas to the Mercados. Somebody did. I can't prove that it was Abraham Israel Pereira, but I like to think so. Similarly, one of the Baruch Lousadas, David, married a Montesinos. Again, I asked myself, did Abraham Israel Pereira somehow facilitate that introduction? Although there are many questions there, I can give you a positive fact here, which is his son, Jacob, certainly helped the Baruch Lousadas. The Den Haag Lousadas, who in fact were the bulk of the Lousadas in the Netherlands, revolved around him, I think, like planets. He married one of them, Sarah, around 1680. Two Lousada brothers-in-law, and I name them there, were investors in his military financing business, named Mercado and Pereira. And you ask yourself, how on earth did the Lousadas, who had no money at this stage, or not much, how did they pay the dowry? I think Jacob actually financed the dowry. Can't prove that, but I think he must have. Sarah's father, Isaac Lousada, participated in the synagogue operating from Jacob's house. And there are records of contributions, small contributions he made. In Den Haag, the Beth Jacob congregation eventually moved to that synagogue there in 1743, well after Jacob died. Jacob's will is a most fascinating document, and I'll endeavour to unravel it. It shows amazingly intimate connections with the Baruch Lousadas. It shows Moses Baruch Lousada of London, who married Jacob's niece Rachel. It shows Jacob Baruch Lousada of London and then Amsterdam. His daughters got a legacy from Jacob Pereira. Abraham Baruch Lousada was a cousin germain of Abraham Israel Pereira, and I'll talk about that shortly. So we ask, how was Abraham Baruch Lousada and his father Isaac related to the Israel Pereiras? And that is because we are talking about a cousin germain, which pair of parents were siblings? Because a cousin germain means that you have one of the parents is a sibling of one of the other parents. It's probably not the men who are the siblings. And because Isabel Mendes de Lousada from Vinhais had a sister Beatrice, Portuguese for Beatrice, I thought it had to be this way. I thought it had to be that Isaac Baruch Lousada was one of the siblings of Isabel, and Beatrice Geronima was actually Beatrice. For a number of years, I had this in my mind and got absolutely nowhere with it. There's a good reason for this. There is one good reason, at any rate. There isn't a parent there called Geronima, and it's pretty obvious that Beatrice Geronima, the mother of Abraham Israel Pereira, was actually Beatrice, daughter of either Geronima or Geronimo. That is a flaw, not a fatal flaw, but you have to turn the handsprings and stand on your head to make that hypothesis work. Eventually, after too long a time, and I'm ashamed how long it took me to think of this idea, because those more experienced perhaps would think of it immediately. A much more promising idea is that Isaac Baruch Lousada, I call him Isaac 42, he married a young sister of the mother of Abraham Israel Pereira. In other words, Luna was a sister of Beatrice Geronima, and she was a second wife of Isaac. She was quite a lot younger than Beatrice Geronima, and I think that is the model I've been working with. I can't prove it, but it's starting to stack up as a viable theory. So here's what we know about the Lousadas in Madrid. We have no direct evidence linking Isaac 42 to Madrid. We know the son, Antonio of Isabel Mendes de Lousada, left a will in Madrid. Isabel had brothers Fernando, Pedro, Antonio, Diogo, and Francisco. And Isaac was probably one of the brothers, not Fernando, who stayed in Vinhais as a shoemaker, a cobbler, but one of the others. And there is no way of telling which one it was. In my genealogies, I identify Isaac with Francisco on the basis of death date, but that is a little arbitrary. We know, well, I'm quite confident now that Isaac married Luna, a young aunt of Thomas Henriques Pereira or Abraham Israel Pereira. The family had been in Madrid since about 1610. Our work has shown that. Isaac was in Livorno by about 1640 with his second wife, Luna. And the question which springs to mind is, certainly Isaac has got a dowry to marry Luna. He's become like an employee of the Henriques Pereira. And I think maybe he was an employee. I think he went to Madrid. I think he went to Livorno, not just to become a religious Jew himself, but also to represent the family in a thriving commercial environment at a time when Abraham Israel Pereira or Thomas Henriques Pereira is anxious to get assets out of Spain. To see how Isaac qualified for this place in the sun, we will look at Jacob's will a little more. It tells many stories about a family called Henriques Fa and also the Baruch Lousadas. This diagram I'm about to show is a bit complicated. Don't be frightened. We'll unravel it later. Here's how we do it. Jacob was a cousin germain of Abraham Henriques Fa. And here there's not much doubt about how this happened. Isaac Henriques Fa, Isaac 1635, who was a very senior and experienced merchant in his own right. He married a sister, it might have been a sister-in-law of Abraham Israel Pereira. And so therefore, their son, Abraham Henriques Fa, was a cousin of Jacob Israel Pereira. Jacob was also an uncle of Rachel Baruch Lousada, whose maiden name was Henriques Fa, and she was a daughter of Isaac. So here we have Jacob was both brother-in-law and nephew of Isaac Henriques Fa. How on earth could that have happened? They're in different generations. The answer is quite simple. Cousin Abraham and Rachel were half siblings as follows. And this looks quite simple now, but when you are in real life trying to wrestle with this, it takes a little while to become happy that this is the correct view of what happened. I'm troubled about this now. A complication springs immediately forward, though, which was that there is another sister, another daughter of Abraham Israel Pereira called Rebecca. Rebecca can be found in the De Pinto manuscript as marrying Jacob De Pinto. Genealogists love this when children have the same name because it tells you a bit about their background. And I think in this case, Rebecca 1182 must have been a stepdaughter rather than a biological daughter of Abraham Israel Pereira. Rebecca, who married Jacob De Pinto, previously married Isaac de Matos, who was a relative on the maternal grandmother's side. In the internet, she's muddled up with another daughter called Rachel, who married a Coutinho, but that confusion will no doubt be unscrambled at some point. The other marriage, the 1648 marriage, is the interesting one in this context because Rachel De Pinto first married Isaac Israel Pereira, who was Jacob's brother. Unfortunately, he died young, and Rachel was hurriedly married off to a chap called Isaac Lopez Suazo, who, as every Dutch schoolchild knows, famously lent 2 million florins in a wooden trunk to William of Orange to invade England and to become King of England. Happily, the money was repaid, and I believe the wooden trunk is in a museum somewhere in Holland. Good news for us is that this makes Jacob Israel Pereira brother-in-law of Isaac Lopez Suazo. And I think in some ways Jacob Israel Pereira became even more important as time went by to William of Orange, because in the battles with the French, which fear of the French was the cause for the glorious revolution of 1688, where William of Orange became King of England, or co-King of England, co-monarch, he became an extremely important support ally of William of Orange, and fairly wealthy as well. Returning briefly to the other Isaac, the uncle, who outlasted his nephew by possibly a decade or so. His wife, according to the Confessions of Samuel Barb, was a sister of the second wife, Abraham Israel Pereira. And the Confessions of Samuel Barb are a little terse, a little short on words, so it's hard to discern exactly what he's saying, but I think, in my own mind, that they were both Henriques Pharaohs, because we know the Israel Pereiras are extremely close to the other Isaac, the first Isaac Henriques Fa, you can look at the 1647 funerals they attended to see that. The two branches, the two Isaacs were members of different branches of the, they were cousins, but members of different branches. I think probably both Isaac Henriques Fa, both 1386 and 1635 were brothers-in-law. Certainly Isaac 11635 was. And if Isaac 1386 wasn't a brother-in-law, he was something pretty close. Now we have a quick look at Jacob again. His first wife was Rebecca de Paiva, and their son Moses Pereira de Paiva was written about by Jonathan Shawson, and also Edgar Samuel. He was a remarkable man. He was a gem merchant in India and a pioneer amateur ethnographer who's interested in the human races of Southeast Asia. The second wife of Jacob Israel Pereira was not quite so distinguished. And you ask yourself, how could a poor woman like this marry someone so eminent? Well, the answer is she was a relative. And I believe she was a relative in particular by this route here, although which I can't prove it because Abraham 1875 up there is a very mysterious and enigmatic figure. We only know one thing about him. But I think Sarah was also a relative on the Israel Pereira side and possibly also on the Henriques Fa side as well. So she was a relative. The dowry wasn't a problem. Jacob would finance it himself in some kind of circular transaction. And so I think we need to look at the Henriques Fa a little more to see how this works. Here they are, the ones we know about in Amsterdam. The records that we know them from are Dotar. 4 Henriques Fa were members of Dotar in succession. Is listed. We know the Henriques Fa came from Villa Flor like the Israel Pereiras did. I mentioned the 1647 funerals of the young children of Isaac 1 through 8, 1386. And they were known also as Teralta, which is a little town in southern Portugal, I think it is. But they had several trading aliases. The Dirksen was a trading alias of Isaac 1635. Lily was a trading alias of the other branch of the family. We can attach Moses Baruch Lousada quite easily here because he was married to Rachel Fa, the daughter of Isaac 1635. And amazingly, Moses had a first wife, also named Henriques Fa. And was she a half sister of the first wife? Good question. Maybe both wives were cousins. And I was thinking about this, and one of the most amazing things that's ever happened to me occurred at this point. Family tree DNA told me that I matched Jared Ross, a Sephardic world speaker, who descends from this person here, Sima the Lima, who is the daughter of Isaac 1635. Now, so far back, these sort of genetic links do not constitute proof, but they are very suggestive of a link. And I'm looking for ideas, and I seize upon this. And here's what I do with it. The children of Isaac Baruch Lousada 42, I'll say a word or two about them, come in 4 cohorts. There are the children of Luna, David, who we've already met in my previous talk, and Abraham Baruch Lousada, who was the cousin germain of Abraham Israel Pereira. Of course, there was a child, or the children of the first marriage of Isaac, namely Jacob Baruch Lousada, who I've mentioned, of London and Amsterdam. But there are also children from Esther's first marriage. My 7 times great grandfather, Aaron of Barbados, was a stepchild because there is evidence that his father was actually named David, so he was a stepchild. The enigmatic Abraham 1875, the only way I can fit him in is that he was a legitimate son, but a non-biological son of Isaac. This may all sound complicated, but I do think there are 4 cohorts of the children of this generation. to make that hypothesis work, I need to propose Esther as his sister. And it's quite a neat hypothesis. If Moses' father married also Henriques Fa, that explains why Moses had two wives, Henriques Fa, they were cousins. So armed with that confidence, I can then insert Abraham Israel Pereira into this chart. And there is his aunt Luna, and ask now, how did the less wealthy Baruch Lousadas from Vinyash come to marry the more wealthy Rodrigue Pereira from Villaflor? The answer, it's not a complete answer. The answer is, in Madrid around 1620, maybe 1622, they married into the Henriques Fa family. Then the Henriques Fa married into the Rodrigues Pereira at about 1630. That would have been Isaac, the brother, and other marriages as well. Finally, around 1638 in Madrid, Isaac married Luna. As I say, it's not a complete answer because it doesn't explain how the Baruch Lousadas came to marriage the Henriques Fa, but I think in my mind it is a step forward. So now I'm busy trying to collect evidence of the Henriques Fa back into Madrid because we haven't found much. We do have a note of Julian Henriques, who was in Madrid in 1631. He was a wool buyer with Fernando Montesinos. He appears, I think it's in Rouen in 1649. It has to be the same guy, there's not many of them. He was a trading associate in Rouen in 1649 with Lopo Rodrigue Pereira. And they were dealing with the Balthasar and Gaspar Rodrigue, and I think they were Rodrigue Pereiras as well. I don't know what town in Spain they were, but I think they were in Spain. We know of a Gaspar Rodrigue Pereira. A document was found where he was in Malaga trading with Manuel de Toralta, who's actually Isaac 1635, or Robert Dirksen den Alden, the older, because there are other Albert Dirksens apparently. So that's ongoing research, but now we can look at some specific Baruch Lousadas to see how the picture I've painted plays out. In London, we have Moses Baruch Louzada, who came from France, I think probably Rouen. He was also known as Antonio. And here is the 1649 signature, which Michael Vast found. I don't know how Michael Vast found it. He's a magician. But you can see the signature is Antonio Fernandez Louzada, the same name as his shoemaker cousin in Madrid, in Portugal would have. I think he was imitating Antonio Fernandez Carvajal, the unofficial pioneer of Jewish resettlement of London. Moses was on the first Muhammad Bevis Marks in 1633. He wrote the bylaws and was elected first Gabai. In other words, it was obvious he was literate and enumerate, facile in both Spanish and Portuguese, a useful man, and a little piece of evidence for why I think he worked for the Pereiras. He was useful. The amazing thing about the first Muhammad and Bevis Marks is all three members are closely, I think, related to Abraham Israel Pereira. Moses was a cousin, not a cousin germain, but a cousin. David Abravanel was close to Manasseh ben Israel, as we know is indebted to Pereiras. Some say that David Abravanel was a brother-in-law of Manasseh ben Israel. Others disagree. I think he was close at any rate. The third member was Elias de Lima, and because there aren't many de Limas, and because Abraham Israel Pereira's Hamburg brother, who died in Amsterdam under the name Jacob, married Deborah de Lima, I think probably, this is hypothesis again, I think Elias de Lima was a brother-in-law of Abraham Israel Pereira. And so you can see that if this is true, then the first Muhammad at Bevis Marks has got Abraham Israel Pereira's stamp all over it. Very quickly, this tightly knit Muhammad obtained a very important document from Charles II, giving written protection against the malicious merchants who had endeavoured either to dislodge these Jews from London or to extort money from them. This was the first written protection for Jews in the resettlement and achieved something that Emanuel Israel wasn't able to achieve, a tangible evidence that Jews were actually welcome in London. We have a signature of 1664 for Moses Baruch Lousada, and I don't know what handwriting experts would say, but there's some similarity. But of course, now he's Moses Baruch Lousada. He also achieved something extremely important for the Amsterdam Jews. The Falmouth Customs Battle in 1680, the ship Experiment had 30 consignments on board, all nominally owned by representatives of Amsterdam Jews in London, but actually directed each one to their correspondent in Amsterdam. The customs agent in Falmouth wanted to unload the ship and inspect the cargo as was appropriate for aliens. A massive battle erupted, court cases, suggestions the jury was bribed and other things. Customs agent lost his job, the ship wasn't unloaded. And by this means, Moses Baruch Lousada with Jacob Israel Pereira performed a vital role in protecting the Barbados-Amsterdam trade, because until the Dutch colonies became active, Barbados was a critical part of the, particularly the sugar trade and ancillary products with Amsterdam. So towards the end of his life, he signs his name, Moses Baruch Lousada, does, spelled slightly differently, still probably the same handwriting. And towards the end of his life, he's now married to Jacob Israel Pereira's niece. And so Moses finishes his life in London as well connected as he started, extremely well connected to royalty, a powerful man, quite a feat. My 7 times great-grandfather, Aaron, in Barbados, I think he was a little slow. He was slow to be Indianised, in other words, to become a fully legalised merchant in Barbados. I believe that the Baruch Lousadas inhabited the Mikado business and in effect inherited it, because at the end of his days in Barbados in 1695, Aaron was one of the wealthiest merchants in Barbados, all due to his sister Gracia, I think, who married David Raphael de Mikado. She retired to Curacao in about 1700 and married into the Caceres family, but I can't find how she was related to all the other eminent de Caceres. Perhaps one day someone will find it out. Aaron married Rachel Gomez Henriques. He was slow to be married as well, married sometime in the early 1670s. I think there was an introduction somehow. I didn't know who she was. It took me 10 years, and then I read Carsten Wilke. Carsten Wilke wrote about the literary circle that grew up in France between Paris and Rouen. The proponents of this, the Portuguese ambassador Manuel Fernandes Villarreal, was garroted in Lisbon. The poet Antonio Henriques Gomez died in a Seville inquisitional prison. I think Rachel was possibly a niece, daughter, sister of Antonio, and she was sent off to Barbados in an arranged marriage for her safety. And I'm quite pleased that this happened, because she is obviously, she's a 7 times great-grandmother. I talked about David Baruch Lousada of Livorno, Rouen, Barbados and Amsterdam last year. And he reminds us that there's a lot more to be learned about Rouen. Now, I say Rouen here in inverted commas because I can't prove that Rouen is part of the story, but I think it has to be. And there's an area for future research to fill in the gaps as to what happened here. We know that in Rouen there were links with Jamaica through the Lamagos. We know that there was a Montesinos connection with the Lamagos. We know that London was first settled from Rouen by Antonio Fernandez Carvajal. Now, I asked myself, was it in Rouen about this time David Raphael de Mikado met all the Baruch Lousada cousins? Because he must have met them somewhere, because you cannot have 7 people agreeing on something unless they're all together. You can't do Zoom at that time. And you can't, we all know that you can't have agreement around the table unless everybody's present and the meeting goes on for long enough. because what was agreed between David Raphael Mercado and the Lousadas was that 2 males would go to Barbados, 2 in London, with the representation in Amsterdam. And of course, there was the marriage with Gracie. I'd like to know more about all this, but it's an area for future research. There were other marriages I mentioned in the previous talk. David Baruch Lousada married a Montesinos on his way back to Amsterdam from Barbados, and I think he stopped in France on the way. Moses had 2 Henriques Fa sisters, probably married in Rouen, we'd like to find out. David's second marriage was to Esther Rodrigue de Costa, who was born in Paris, and I think therefore that this marriage probably occurred in France. Possibly it was Paris, not Rouen. The marriage was regularised in Amsterdam, but it occurred beforehand. And of course, Rachel Gomez Henriques, my 7 times great grandmother, married. I think she was sent out to Barbados in an arranged marriage. In the next eminent Lousada is Aaron of Jamaica, who was the leading plantation financier of Jamaica, an extremely wealthy person. But I think what happened here was similar to the previous story, that he inherited the Lamago business. They populated the Lamago business, and after Aaron and Isaac Lamago retired to London, the Baruch Lousadas are left in charge. He married Rachel Mendes de Costa. His son Emanuel, the man whose will was discussed by Stanley Mervis in a previous presentation, took credit for possession of that plantation in Richmond there some years before it was unsold. That picture, of course, confronts the ghastly reality of slavery, if you study it closely. Unfortunately, the Baruch Lousadas of Jamaica were stuck with plantations on the abolition of slavery. But their luck held that when the slavery was abolished, there was compensation paid to the slave owners whose asset has been devalued. And Sir Moses Montefiore, who Abigail Green talked about a little while ago, he raised a vast sum for the British government to pay the compensation to slave owners. And my ancestors were part of that stroke of fortune. A more elevated person spiritually was David Baruch Lousada of Suriname. He was a great-great-grandson of David, who we talked about. On one account, he was always first in every holy enterprise, the father and head of the descendants of the prophets, a sage with an uplifted face. The understanding, the holy of God, the honoured elder, who chanted pleasantly the songs of Israel within the congregation named Baruch Day Shalom in the city of Suriname. Wise and understanding communal leader, exalted, pious, exalted and humble rabbi of blessed memory, who in his lifetime was also a Mohola and head of the yeshiva, whose name, I can't read that because I've got pictures of people in front of me. And so that was David of Suriname. You can find him written up in the literature. Emanuel Baruch Lousada, London, was the developer of Sidmouth. He was one of the first Jews to own land in England. He didn't get permission, he just did it. And his holding is commemorated by this called the Long Painting, which you can find in Sidmouth. His father died young, so I think his wealth probably came from his Lamago mother. He obtained from the College of Arms in 1777 a family crest, later used, actually misused, by the 5 Lousada dukes. And he married a granddaughter of Solomon de Costa Athis in 1670, and talk about that in the next slide. His brother, Isaac Lousada, lived in number 13 Devonshire Square. That 1749 image is looking across the square from above where Isaac lived. There's not much of Devonshire Square that survived the Second World War, but in this 1749 image, you can see some houses marked Isaac Lindo is opposite. He was related to the Barbados Lindos. His son Emanuel married, son Elias married Rebecca Rebecca Makata, Rebecca Lombrosa de Matas Makata, brother of Abraham, who's the key ancestor of all the English Makatas. Solomon the Costa Atheist lived across Devonshire Square, as did his brother. Jacob Salvador, or Jacob Rodrigue Jesuin, also lived in Devonshire Square. Isaac was a pillar of Anglo-Jewry. I think he was on the Muhammad 9 times. Like his brother Emanuel, his wealth probably came from the Lamagos out of Jamaica. And he, as I say, he was linked by marriage to people across Devonshire Square. His marriage to a daughter of Baron Moses d'Aguilar is an example that Baruch Lousadas had consolidated by now their position amongst the English Sephardi. Baruch Lousadas became worthy of marriage with wealthy newcomers. Two Lopez Pereira children married two Baruch Lousadas. Two Jimenez family members from Amsterdam married Baruch Lousadas. Two Francos from Livorno, in the jewellery coral business at the time, diamond and coral, married Baruch Lousadas, as indicated. Not just Sephardim, the Barrows and official diverse days were also pleased to be associated with the Baruch Lousadas. So they really had acquired a bit of a cachet by this stage. And now one finds that many large English Sephardic families have Baruch Lousada ancestry, and I mentioned some of them: Aguilar, Lopez, Makata, and Montefiore, and Pereira, not the Israel Pereiras, but other Pereiras. Sir Anthony Baruch Lousada, my mother's third cousin and grandfather of Julian, who I think is in the room. He married, he's a grandson of Mary and Helen Makata, who was Herbert George Lousada's wife. There's a portrait of Sir Anthony taken by his daughter Sandra. And there's a photograph of Sir Anthony with the Queen Mother and other dignitaries. He was knighted in 1675 for services to art, and was chairman of the trustees of Tate Gallery in that period. He also claimed to be related to the Duke of Lousada, and he had a little argument with Edgar Samuel about that. And the last of the eminent Lousadas is a chap called Charles Terence Lousada. I don't know that he was lucky. He was lucky because of his family background. He disproves the rule. He was a self-made property developer. Any property developer who makes a lot of money has to be lucky. You've got to escape the creditors at some stage or other, which he did. He became quite wealthy. He was the High Sheriff of Bedfordshire, hence the fancy attire. Curiously, his daughter-in-law recently filled the same post. He was a helicopter pilot, trout fisherman, rugby player. And he was the brother of a chap I worked closely with, Peter Lousada, who collected Lousada material for over 20 years. He met the distantly related Hans Lousada. Hans Lousada is the ancestor of the current-day Leiden Lousadas who came out of Suriname. Peter met him in Tehran, and they couldn't figure out how they were related, but I now have some understanding how this happened. And Peter discovered the Dursdays in Budapest who claimed Lousada ancestry, and I call them, they're like Hungarian Barrows, and they are possibly the subject of more research in another talk. So come to the conclusion of these remarks, I think the Baruch Lousadas were fortunate in the marriage links they made. These links provided a bridge from provincial Portugal to the Atlantic world. I'd like to thank Edgar Samuel, Tom Teal and Michael Vass for their support and encouragement, Jared Ross for his advice on the Nunes-Vass DNA match, to Fernando Gonzalez de Campo Ramon for his help with the Spanish and Portuguese records, Maria Jose Surabas for help with Spanish records, Florbella Vega Fada for help with the Portuguese records. And although we didn't talk about the Pressbergs and much, I'd like to thank Randy Schoenberg anyway for help with the Barrows and official diverse days. So that's really, David and Tom, at the end of the formal talk. If there are any questions, I'll endeavour to answer them. And so there we go.
Thank you very much. That was fascinating. Before we have questions, can I just give a quick plug for the new Sephardic Genealogical Society and provide a context, because the sort of research that Julian is doing and we were discussing here is quite important for that, and that it's possible to create an entire family tree of the Western Sephardim, because there probably never were more than sort of 50,000 of us at any particular moment. And at the moment, the Sephardic Genealogical Society has a project making the accounts books of the London congregation accessible and searchable. We're very early stages of that. But of course, what we can eventually do is start to match up the genealogical information with the information from the accounts, and then later from notarial accounts and so forth. And what we will have, not just for the Sephardim, but for historians and those interested in history generally, a really good insight into the start of globalization. So that, for example, in Julian's story, we are seeing a family starting in Portugal and Spain and ending up in the sort of the Caribbean and everywhere else. And so this is a real sort of opportunity for us both to understand our past and to contribute to the world. So should anyone be interested in sponsoring us, or indeed know anyone who is interested in sponsoring us, would be very grateful to hear. Julian, would you like to close your slideshow, and then I can hand over to Tom perhaps for a question.
Yeah. Thank you, Julian. That's absolutely fascinating. I'm still dizzy from all those names and hypotheses and the connections between family members. Do you think it's all the Lousadas that you mentioned are family of each other, or are you still unsure about how they are all related? Is it one family?
I believe that all the Lousadas I mentioned are the same family. Some did not use the Baruch first name, like what people I call the Den Haag Lousadas, but I believe they are actually related. There are many other Lousadas, of course. In Livorno and elsewhere, you can find Levi Lousadas. There were Lombroso Lousadas. There was one Israel Louzada in Livorno, and of course there are other Lousadas who came on different paths, but not descending, I don't think, from Amador, who got treated by the Coimbra Inquisition. So not all Lousadas are family members, but all the ones I talked about were.
Thank you. Bruce, you have a question.
Yeah, David, it's actually triggered by the interaction between your epilogue to Julian's story, which is, how would you imagine, excuse me, the power of geospatial analytics, AI, and the brute force of Julian to an exponent combined in the Sephardic genealogical pursuit, such that, it does sound like there's a consistency of migratory aspect. And the geospatial analytics that I know of could help with reinforcing, or at least reminding intergenerationally that was going on, much like the seasonal migration of birds and other species. And so when I listen to all three of you, Ton, Julian, and David, I mean, I do hear this kind of echoing of story that could be a pattern recognition that would help so we because of the Sephardim journeys over this period have a body of data which is the holy grail of AI professions, to have a body of data that could be mined to see if it's useful. So if that's a question or if that's an observation, I don't know.
It's a very good observation. We have quite a lot of sort of tech going on in the background. I mean, much more than you would normally expect from genealogy. I'm afraid the honest problem is that we have no money, and if we were talking about sort of Jewish pirates of the Caribbean or strange Da Vinci Code sort of nonsense, we would be getting that income. But
David, that was actually my point. They don't care about the AI genii, don't care about the Sephardim. They care that the Sephardim have represented a constancy of data, right? Yeah. So that's the asset that we're talking about, that the AI companies, including the Googles, etc., would find very intriguing to apply their admixture to.
Don't think we haven't thought about it, but it's early days. We'd be really interested if you want to send us an email, and perhaps we can discuss further, because it's a huge subject. Thank you for that. Julian Louzada, welcome. Do you have a question?
Well, I don't really have a question other than to say how much I enjoy Julian's presentation. I'm the son of Sir Anthony Lousada that you mentioned, and perhaps that makes me a relative of yours, Julian. My father was immensely private about the Lousada history, and I found myself many times trying to discover the origins of the Lousada. I have an extensive family tree, which I'm more than happy to share with you, that my father had made before he died. And I just wanted to sort of make contact, really. That's just by pure chance, somebody sent me this link, and I'd like to stay in touch and contribute more as time goes on. And Julian, thank you so much for your extensive research, and your colleagues. And I find it very exciting. Thank you.
Nice to meet you, Julian.
Nice to meet you, Julian.
Is that a coincidence that you are both named Julian?
No,
it's a family name.
Surely not.
No, I was named after your grandfather.
Yeah. A lovely man, I hear. He died just before I was born.
And Julian Land mentioned Julian Henriques at some point, but that was centuries ago, I believe. Is there a line from that Julian to you both?
Are you referring to Julian Henriques, are you?
Yes.
I'd like to think so, I don't know.
Okay. Francis Rifkin has the usual question. Are there any women involved?
Can I say something?
Well,
Would you let me?
Yes, Francis, go ahead.
Thank you. I do think this is a brilliant account. I think all of the things that you're putting through are wonderful, because I grew up in a set of Sephardi, very loud, noisy, shouty sort of households. And they were actually, it was quite difficult as a girl or a woman to actually say a pleading word. So I do know what the traditions are, but the women were very heavy and very frightening. My aunt, absolutely terrifying. But what I think we need to do is set a set of criteria that includes the role of women over history, because it's always wiped out. And yet the women, they not only gave birth, etc., but they were linking between families, they were doing politics. It would be wonderful to hear about it. And some of it I know is on record. So, Julian, have you anything that you could add about that?
I tried to acknowledge that Francis, by my 7 times great grandmother, Gracia, who married David Raphael de Mercado, and really I think was responsible for the Baruch Lousadas actually getting to Barbados and all that. Wilfred Samuel credits her with running David Raphael Mercado's business after he died in 1685. And so he calls her a very remarkable woman. Actually, I think that she probably ran after her cousin Aaron, my 7 times great grandfather, died in 1695. I think before she went to Curacao, I think she probably ran that business as well. In other words, she ran the family business for 15 years, I'd say. And so, I mean, I tried to say that, but
no more, because what's happening is that the balance is always strongly about the line through men. I know that it's all tradition, it's actually quite a complicated issue, but somehow the role that women played in holding those communities together was enormous. When I look at my great aunt and I hide under the bed, frankly, she was so scary and she married them all off like mad. She tried to marry me off. And, but those roles, although they look to me now as a sexist woman and looking at women and going, oh, it's only about getting married. Actually, she was like a sort of anchor in the family, and all her predecessors were, and the next one. And I think we should be able, comrades and friends and colleagues and cousins, to trace this through in a methodological way, please.
Well, David, we must be able to find someone to talk about this.
Well, I mean, I think the first issue here, of course, is that most of the historic documents are about men, and they talk about women much less. I mean, going back to what we were just discussing before with Bruce, I suspect that if or when we can get everything sort of nicely organized, we will start to see patterns of data that are not otherwise visible. I mean, last week I was watching a presentation on the new database on the cemeteries in Turkey, and by mapping them, they've been able to suddenly quickly to identify that sort of family groups are buried in the same place, which they had never worked out before. But once you've got the data organized and sort of geomapped and whatever, it's perfectly possible to do. I mean, Francis, and indeed anybody, I mean, we are very aware that women are sort of under discussed. If anyone has suggestions of subjects other than sort of Donna Gracia and the normal stuff, we'd be really interested to hear and to present.
Okay, Bob Kozowski says, wonderful talk. And Julian, could you speak about the location of some of the archival resources? For example, that will you mentioned of one of the early Lousadas. Where did you find it? And is it online? And maybe something about sources in general.
Well, Tom, I guess you are my teacher on much of this, and I think your talk on the Amsterdam archives is a central reading for people in this field. There's such a wealth of material in Amsterdam, and even though it's Amsterdam-based documents, a lot of history is actually recorded in the documents from one angle, one aspect or another. The notary archives in Amsterdam the Amsterdam City Archives are fantastic. The well-known websites, but your talk, Tom, really is really the go-to reference on this.
I believe that's the one talk that we did not record, David.
I will say something though, and that is that I know you have mentioned that the Amsterdam City Archives are working on those systems. there's one little tip for beginners, which I've learned the hard way. When somebody gives you an image number from the Amsterdam City Archives, you cannot search for that. What you have to do is you have to go to chat. You go to Amsterdam City Archives, you go to chat, and the chat is only open from 1 till 5 on weekdays. And you have to ask them, give me the public URL for this image. And they say, the first question is, how on earth did you get this? Because this is internal. But that is how you find, and then once you've got the public URL, you can then get onto the notary archive or whatever, and you can then look at documents. But you cannot get there from the image reference. So from the academic point of view and proper references, you can't, unless you want to disguise your sources, you cannot just give the image reference number. You have to give the public URL.
Thank you.
Julian, you also mentioned researching in the Madrid archives. Was that with Fernando or Matthew or somebody else there?
Yes, Fernando. Maria Jose Suribas did something for me as well, but most was done by Fernando. And we went into the National Historic Archives, the Palace Archives, because I was trying to get the story of the Lousada Dukes, and the Palace Archives has some of that. So Fernando dug into that, but the most amazing thing Fernando did for me was that he helped me decipher. I think there were 100 images from the Coimbra Inquisition records of the trial of Amador Lousada and his relatives, and Fernando got an amazing amount out of that. I could understand one word out of 100. Fernando could understand one word out of 3, and it was amazing what he got out of that. I just don't know how he did it.
Yeah, he's an outstanding researcher.
Ari Ergensoy asks, what's the relation between Baruch and Baruch? You made it sound like they were separate.
Well, they are, because although, I mean, within the family there is immense confusion on this point, but the Baruchs descend from Simeon, son of Baruch, who came to Barbados from Italy, probably Livorno. So he was Simon, son of Baruch. And in Barbados, he was not so good at English. And eventually his name was turned into Simon Barrow. So that's how the Barrow started. Confusingly, a number of Baruch Lousadas also referred to themselves as Barrow. And so Moses Baruch Lousada of London also sometimes called himself Moses Barrow. So there is immense confusion about this, but actually there is no real connection. Although I must say that the Barrows insist that they have Baruch Lousada ancestry, and I cannot prove this, but they may well have. But it happened in Italy, not in it happened in Italy, but I can't find the marriage in the French reference book on Ketchepot. So the marriage was not in Livorno, but I believe my Barrow cousins when they say they have Baruch Lousada ancestry, but nobody can prove it.
You mentioned the Louzada dukes. Could you sort of very briefly just tell us a little about them?
Would you like me to? I've got 5 slides on the subject. Should I go into that again, or just?
Yeah, if you like, that would be great. I should tell everyone that sort of Julian's in Australia. He had to get up at sort of 4 a.m. to make this presentation. So
I'll have to share the screen again.
Yeah.
And I will have to go to. I'll have to go to the last slide.
Because virtually every Sephardic family has a story of some sort of aristocratic connection, and of course most of these are completely untrue. So
I think it should go now. It's frozen. Come on.
It fell asleep.
I'm sorry, David. It's.
Oh no worries. Can you just sort of tell us who they were and how they became dukes.
Okay, here we go. We might, here we go. So this is the mystery of the Baruch Lousadas. They had good family connections. They've even got descent from the Portuguese royal family through the Lamego Curial link, but not content with their own economic advance, they sought further distinction, and they pursued a very grand title indeed. And dukes sit next to kings. You know, it's very grand. I've got to talk about who they were trying to descend themselves from, the Duke de Lousada. This will be this man here, the Duke de Lousada. There's only one Duke de Lousada, Jose Fernandez Miranda y Saavedra. He was a key player in the Bourbon modernization of Madrid and the Spanish government. He had Guzman ancestry. Most famous Guzman, of course, was D'Olivares, that painted by Velázquez. And his financial reforms in that year, the year 1623-43, written up by David Boyajian. And it was of immense importance to the Portuguese New Christians who flocked back to Madrid to take part in this. Well, it turned into a financial paradise for them because what D'Olivares wanted was that he wanted them to he wanted to use the financial power of the Portuguese New Christians instead of solely for the benefit of Amsterdam, which was hurting Spain in trade. He wanted the Portuguese New Christian finance to be helping Spain. And it succeeded to some extent. It slowed the Spanish decline, but it was great for the Portuguese New Christians because the whole aim of this was for them to deliver local currency in the Spanish Netherlands, and they got government paper or bonds back in Madrid. And of course, financiers today would do this as well. What you did was use the bonds in Madrid as collateral. You would borrow up as much as you could based on the security of the government bonds. You'd shift all your liquid assets out of Spain. And so when the time came to leave Spain, you left behind something solvent in Spain, and all was well. Anyway, it was great for the Portuguese New Christians. Going back to the Duke of Lousada, he served as the right-hand man for Carlos III, the best of the Bourbon monarchs, a droll man, as you can tell by the Mengs portrait there. He served Carlos in Naples and Madrid for over 40 years. There's another amazing sculpture in the Madrid Botanic Gardens of Carlos III. The Duke was the second son and, of course, lacked a title. So Carlos created the title for him, Duke de Lousada, named after the Duke's father's one of the hereditary properties in Spain, Lousada at Bembibre in Asturias, and it was therefore the Duke of Lousada. But this was done as a free gift to the Duke because Carlos wanted to have him work for him. He needed a title, and that's how the Duke of Lousada was created. There's only ever one of them. The Duke did not marry, and there were 5 Lousada dukes. They were not descendants of the Duke of Lousada. Undaunted, they called themselves Duke de Lousada y Lousada, which is a curious cocktail of Portuguese and Spanish. Isaac was the first of them. Emanuel II, his son, who was, I think, the ringleader, one who dreamt up this arrangement. And 3 Lousada dukes followed him: Horace Francis, Francis Clifford, and Edward Eugene. Edward Eugene was married into the Jewish aristocracy of Budapest, amazingly enough, and that's where the D'Estates. That's why the D'Estates got in touch with us. Luckily for these 5 characters, few people noticed the peculiar change of name. I'm sure you all noticed the peculiar change in name because, apart from anything else, it's a curious cocktail of Portuguese and Spanish. There was a lack of official authentication, and Fernando found for me a letter from Emanuel in the Madrid Royal Archives asking for help in getting hold of the title deeds. Well, how can you be a duke if you haven't got a document saying you're a duke from the king? So that's a crucial bit of evidence. And finally, I've done this little presentation here. they used an unofficial coat of arms. Now, this is the coat of arms from the real Duke de Lousada. It's got no chevron. The chevron's a V-shaped thing on the shield, and no fourth dove. When Emanuel 87 of London got official grant of arms in 1777 or 87, he had to add things to it so that it did not infringe the Duke's coat of arms. And it's like with intellectual property law, patents or anything else, you've got to distinguish your art from the prior art. Here, you can see that there's been a chevron added in the shield shape, and above the shield shape, you can see a fourth dove perched on the helmet there. So they added a dove on a green hill, and they added a chevron. And that was obtained by Emanuel 87. Well, the dukes didn't like the thought that they should be distinguished from the real duke, and so they got rid of the chevron. You see, there's no chevron there. And they did, however, leave the fourth dove. And so what you have there is an unofficial hybrid coat of arms. And that is the third giveaway as to what was going on there. So that's, in summary, David, what happened with the Lousada Dukes.
Oh dear. Thank you. I like that.
If I can just add, David, just add that, I mean, I'm not trying to, some members of the family are unhappy that I've questioned the, so we say, the standing of the Lousada Dukes, because some people are very fond of the notion. And in fact, I actually admire their immense, is a Yiddish word, chutzpah, I don't know how you say it.
Chutzpah.
Chutzpah, they had immense chutzpah, and I think actually the Sephardim demonstrated immense chutzpah wherever they went in the Sephardic diaspora. But so I admire their chutzpah, but I am nonetheless unpopular in some areas of the family.
What's the equivalent in Ladino, please, for chutzpah? Is there a Ladino word for chutzpah?
I wish there was. I don't know.
Well, it would be Portuguese for the Lousadas. I'm afraid I don't know.
Be fine.
Sorry, Julian Lousada, I think you wish to claim your dukedom.
My father always claimed it, and hybrid coat of arms that I have on my finger and elsewhere is a single dove with the inscription "Honor me Guide" underneath it. Julian, you probably come across this, but I'm fascinated with this. I always thought there was something slightly unethical about this claim my father liked to pass on to me, but not to my sisters, going back to that earlier question. Who?
David, any questions on Facebook?
No, but let me just double check. No, but I'd like to thank Deborah for her gift to us. That's much appreciated.
Yes.
Shall we?
Yes.
Shall we close down? And our speaker next week is Brian Ham, who will be speaking about Luis Mendez Chavez, who got into trouble trying to sneak Jewish books into Cartagena. He got arrested by the Inquisition in 1648, and that's a fascinating story. And from Latin America, somebody was asking on YouTube if we could have more from Latin America. So thank you for that. And Ton, do you want to close the proceedings?
First of all, thank you, Julian, for talking with us. And we hope that you will come back sometime when the Lousadas are all fit into one family tree. Definitely. And thank you to our viewers on Facebook, and most of all, thank you to our patrons who make all of this possible. And those on Facebook who wish to become patrons, join us on our Patreon page and become a member and support us financially. Thank you. And we hope to see you all next week.